Today we're going to continue with Lot's story in the Old Testament, and we're going to compare it with Abraham's story as well. But what this kind of does, it brings in like really what where we're at in the real world, I guess, in the situation in end times. Um, but in general, we're going to look at the context of where Lot failed as a man and how Abraham, and looking at Abraham's life and how he's prospering and why it matters, you know, in our lives of how we handle ourselves from, getting up, getting going, our everyday activity that moves us into our normal daily lives. And it all comes from every aspect. And so, Lot wasn't not openly wicked, but he was passive. That was a lot of the problem. And he chose Sodom for opportunity. You know, everybody has a choice in their life to make, and so those choices make a difference in our life. And him choosing Sodom, it was economically, growing. And no matter what you look at in, today's time and world, if you want to prosper, you can. If you don't. But look at Abraham's life; he still prospered, but he didn't go out and seek already existing economy that was prospering. What that kind of does is, to me, I believe it allows for contentment. And anytime you're content, you can easily lose your discernment. And essentially, in that discernment, what I mean by that is God wants us to have, conviction and trials and, tribulations, but He wants us to know that uncomfortability that we end up having. And that's what that discernment is there for, is to challenge us, And if we just let that go by the wayside, that's when things become more and more of an issue. But, he stayed comfortable. He basically hesitated when God said to leave. I mean, he basically kept on pushing things off. And anytime you're challenged or have a sinful act that's possibly even coming up in the mind, we have to look to God. And if we keep turning Him away, then all we're doing is refusing to obey God, and essentially we're finding that obedience that God wants for us. And so, in the New Testament, Peter says Lot was distressed and not decisive at all. So he had trouble making decisions. So as life goes on, we have to be eligible to see clarity and have decisiveness. Modern parallel for men that many men today are doing wrong is knowing the culture that they're in. Feeling morale tension. But stay silent to protect their income, their status, and peace. They delay that obedience that we're talking about into pressure, and it forces their hand. And so there's a lot of times there are warnings, and especially in the end times, as it's coming closer and closer, it feels like, as the day's world, everything, worldly changes occur, but we still have chances of changing a lot of it as men and women. The angels had to grab Lot to pull him out. So God's call to men today is, stop normalizing what God calls sin. So most of the time, when we start normally fitting in and our ways seem to make it easy for us to just kind of live day by day. If we don't make those necessary changes, we just fall into contentment, and we just basically live in comfort and don't go out and try to make challenges in our everyday life. And so we have to stand and come forward with those challenges. It's just not a simple, it's going out and just working the day and then coming home and, not having those convictions. Stop trading spiritual authority for economic comfort. And so when you're going out making money, in the world. I mean, you need to take a check and see if I'm living my life right, and stop assuming good intentions equal obedience. And so sometimes we all have good intentions, especially when we are saved, when we are, you know, have God, and if we're baptized and we have the Holy Spirit. But we have to be excited about that. We have to be real, encourage others that, you know, we're in this together. We're not alone. We're not separated. We're not neutralized by the devil. And those are the biggest things in life. And we have to require to keep ourselves united and basically create, you know, basically that discernment, and keep that level of discernment up amongst us. So we have, you know, more conviction, you know, our convictions are normalized, and that way we can kind of become, I guess, essentially, and I guess at a mechanical standpoint, essentially all work together in our own purpose, and God's purpose can live within us. But here's the application to leaders. You know, influence without transformation is failure. You know, Lot is at the city gate, so I mean, he has a purpose. He has a leadership role in, you know, basically in Sodom. You know, he's sitting at the gate meant he's a political authority. He has social influence, and he has leadership status. So he rightfully has, you know, the downfall of Sodom in his hands. You know, but yet Sodom was unchanged. He didn't use any purpose in his life to show God reason to keep Sodom there, because even though it was prosperous and that it was successful for him, they were doing so many things wrong, so many issues were occurred, and so many things that were not helping, you know, the society in itself. And so morale basically was breaking down little by little, and then this extreme measures took place. And so the devil was there and intervening and changing, and so much contentment arose that it was easy to sin and easy to distract the human nature of things. So, you know, we're all at fault. The thing of it is, we just still got to be convicted and, you know, uncomfortable. And the more we live uncomfortable, sometimes the better off we are, knowing that we're on the seat of the edge. And so, you know, there's a cost to everything. So, you know, as living immorality, you know, there's going to be challenges, you know, amongst economics. So, and, you know, as far as how you live economically, what challenges you face, you know, a lot of times you got to look at these as things that God's put in place for a purpose, so that you have reason and that you exist to show others how to go through those trials and tribulations and help others with that issue. I mean, people are out there seeking it, and as a calling that you probably have. And if you're, you know, somebody struggling through like having debt or having lost their job or having an issue with just everyday scenarios that keep coming up to them that are challenging them in the mind, that, you know, you've got to seek God first, and you got to put forth the effort to take that action. And that all comes from whether or not you obey and listen to God. And so those things are majorly important. And so leadership wise, you know, pastors and business owners, public figures and community leaders face pressure all the time. You know, have soft convictions, softened ones. So mainly, you know, where they keep order and where they keep things in purpose. You know, I was thinking about judges and our judicial system, or, you know, for instance, lawyers. I mean, those things are, you know, how much purpose do they have in breaking down our government, or building the government up against us or for us, and those things all take place. And a lot of times we avoid the offense. We don't take action. We don't make moves to show where God really lies and where he stands amongst that activity. that either we're doing or that others are doing. And we need to keep those things in check and in line. And you blend, as far as your faith, the values, in general, to what is, what values your well-being, what values your net worth, your wealth, your entire existence, but your family in its entirety, and what generation, changes occur. But you have to prioritize growth over truth. And truth sometimes is a hard thing to deal with. I mean, it's like a smack on the ground, You get tripped and fall, and it's smacked the face, your face smacked by the ground. I mean, it's sometimes it's a rude awakening, and in this case, it was much more than that. When it comes to Sodom and Gomorrah, as far as warnings. In the end times, many leaders will have platforms. Few will have real authority. And authority comes from obedience and not relevance. So they have to look at its entire spectrum of where a leader truly is, and whether or not they're giving in to, all that contentment and easiness and comfortability, making things look easy, because there's always another opposite reaction to that. So you have to always kind of look in the challenges of what God has out there, because I know He's working in many of us at one time, and His will be paved out. And it's a matter of how it works. Of course, every time, if you look in the Old Testament, coming all the way through the New, God has always put purpose into place, and the devil always tries to come up with new challenges that have to, battle against another, government or another society that exists. And so as we go through certain trials and tribulations, it's all economically done for purpose. And there's always spiritual warfare at place amongst the societies. And you can see where, I guess you can look at paganism. If one thing is in general, a paganism can, falter a society just because of, materialism, all the way up to, worshiping idols. And so those things are such, it's such easy to get into in the discernment, and people don't even realize the causes and effects of it until it's too late, and those changes are hard to come from. I mean, just think of what you believe and what you learn and what you know. They all seem to be good and at a standpoint, but are they really truly there for the real purpose or the right purpose? I mean, just look at the holidays that we have generally throughout the year, and how we actually, go out and display those holidays, and what their reasons really for. Families, children pay for what parents tolerate. So that's the biggest thing is what do we tolerate as parents? What do we actually give into, what we actually receive, and what we do take away. And it's all breaking down. But Lot's greatest loss was not Sodom, it was his daughters. It was his family, the generation that was going forward. And, there's a lot of things about were situations where, in this case, if you have generation of generation that's living in this day and time, we have, grandparents raising their grandchildren instead of their parents raising their children. And it's like those children were not raised properly before. I mean, what do you think is going to happen now? I mean, but there's so many effects and takes place, and you always got to be out looking out for your loved ones. A lot escaped judgment, but his daughters didn't, of course, but absorbed Sodom's worldview and redefined morality, believed survival justified sin. And it's a sad situation when you talk about a situation where he can change those things or make a difference in those effects. And you have to stand firm, stand your ground. And you see that in challenges in today's families all the time. Every family is a little different, how it's built and how it's, handled. Um, there's so much rejection in some parts of the world, but it's why you receive it, how you discipline it, and how you take action to move forward with it. Because every day you take action in a different way, whether it's not taking any action and just letting it slide by, versus taking action, how can we work through it, versus, taking the wrong actions and then us having to battle back and fight back to where we started out. And it's never easy to get back to that level because of trust. Trust is broken much easier today's times. And that's the hard part about, and doing the right thing and doing the wrong thing. As a, following the path of Jesus and God, you just have to ask for prayer and forgiveness. And those have to be willing to forgive you. And that's sometimes the hardest part. And one thing about life is there's nothing simple, and it all breaks down on different ways. It didn't start in a cave. It started in the house in Sodom. Family truth that children learn values from the environment and instruction. So where they went to school, how they played with other kids, what they seen other families that they ate at the dinner table with other families, how mannerisms change from one family to another, and how the generation, sees and perceives that existence of a society in general. The children learn their values right there, from environment more than from instruction. So that's the biggest key point, key takeaway. And that's how generations change from one family to another. Modern family parallels come from parents may teach faith on Sunday. Tolerate culture Monday through Saturday. They allow media, ideology, and peers to disciple their kids. Who's actually affecting your kids, who's working with your kids. That all makes a difference in how you really look at it overall. A lot of talk righteousness, but lived compromise. So it's a big difference. When you live and talk righteousness, and it's a huge, situation. But you just talk, you could just be praying. It could be, talking amongst your family a little bit, trying to talk to your children and give them instruction. But when you don't live the same way you talk, that's where the issues come and arise. And so when you live amongst it, you have to walk the talk and talk the talk, but you got to walk the walk. Because if you don't, then that's where the issues really start to come in, because the environment, you can change your environment, easily walk away from, issues to, bring forth light into that darkness on bad issues. And that's where you have to stand up for your beliefs. End time warnings for families is the last generation before judgment will be, confused about identity, detached from morale, absolutes, and shaped by what parents failed to confront. And so you got to have a good foundation, a good sturdy ground to walk on. And so, the more things you put in place, the more firmer the ground will get. You can instruct it, but you got to learn to walk it. And it's harder to walk it than just to sit there and talk about it. And also means teaching. That means you're going to learn it more and more by teaching it. So my advice would be more to teach it to others rather than just talk about it. The more you teach it to others, the more better you're going to be at understanding it and how to walk it. Without walking it, you're not going to learn it. You're not going to understand it. And so even if you're walking a little bit in gray areas, you have to learn to teach it first. Because when you start teaching it, you start to understand it and comprehend it, and it becomes a lot more easier to walk it. Now, remembering Lot's wife, a family level warning. Lot represents a divided loyalty, love of comfort, emotional attachment to the world. There's so many things that it's easy to get attached to, especially if you're in a prosperous area, where things are given to you much easier. Today we deal with monetary growth and value of things to where it's easy to become materialized because of all the objects, the shiny objects that are out there, and it can also get you easier with the standpoint of greed. I mean, because people want money, want to be able to buy and sell and do things, much more easier. And so the thing of it is how do you look out at life, and where is your loyalty at, and what stands firm in your ground, because those things make a difference. Your families, often stall spiritually because of leaving costs too much. Leaving can cost too much. And the central standpoint is once you get used to an area and you've been living there, how much more like seeded you're into that area. I mean, there's good seeds and bad seeds in the world, and the fruit that that comes out from us, we can either bear good fruits or bad fruits. And sometimes when we let things go that should be looked at upon, and not necessarily in a bad way, just have to move it, motion of how that should have been directed, because being directed is a lot of the issues today. I mean, what is necessarily the punishment, but how is it handled? There's so many things with even the judicial system, and how long it takes for trials to happen, to to things to actually take order, and take place, because some things just aren't simple and things is not easy. And so there's so much more nowadays that people are so much quicker to react or make judgment on, and there's not even been a judgment made. And that's what's it's almost like the society is starting to choose over the judicial system, having the right and correct people in place to make a clear and correct choice. And so that's the problem with a lot of it is things are so much more simpler than what this world brings in, and the complexities, the confusion, all that is what makes the world unhealthy. And so when they come with off the wall conspiracies and things like that, I mean, and the sad part is conspiracy is a bigger word nowadays because of all the things that do transpire, and it's kind of sad because that is essentially where cause and effect exist. And the problem with the judgment of things, the faster judgment actually happens, probably the better, especially when it's without a shadow of doubt, with evidence and everything in place. The trial should probably happen much quicker, rather than just being drug out to a specific time. But that's just the key point is this is way too much time in what's going on. But the families, often install spiritually. That's where it costs too much. Obedience disrupts lifestyles, and holiness feels extreme. Family cannot move forward if one heart is anchored to Sodom. Economic prosperity, the modern day Sodom. Sodom wasn't poor, it was prosperous. Men and families today face career-driven identity, comfort. They have addictions, it's very comforting addiction out there now. Whereas you just get in a certain, simple place and you get comfortable and essentially, and then there's success without you know, stewardship, which kind of more like owning up to what it what it takes to get there. Not just been handed or granted money or given. You know, it's just basically nowadays it's can be gifted is much easier, or just passed down to you from your loved ones, because they do want you to have a prosperous life. Money shapes decisions more than God's voice, and that's when things are troubling or challenging to God, because God wants us to be, He don't want us to be on unease all the time, but He wants us to be knowing that we are challenged by the devil, and essentially it's always spiritual warfare out there. And so, when it comes down to it, how we walk and how we talk will makes that difference. And so we have to surround ourselves with good things sometimes, so we can get the right implication in place, so we can go out and teach, educate our own children, our own families, and our own well-being. So when we see something or do something, we're prepared for it. And that way we can act and react accordingly the way God wants us to. The thing about it is, and we're looking at Sodom as, profitable, but was it holy? No. The morale of it wasn't. That's why God did what He did. What God is calling men and leaders and families to do now. For men, leading spiritually, before crisis. So, there's always temptation, but, it depends on where we're at and how we're, living our daily lives. But it's also how we prepare, preparing our daily lives. So when we wake up in the morning, how we start it, how we finish it, all makes a big difference. And of course in the middle is where everything lies in between. But putting forth the effort to do that with our kids, to start our days off right, to finish our days right, giving our kids and our family the putting the right front forward, because essentially it doesn't take long to fall off and then essentially get comfortable, and then you're at unease because of those decisions you made. Make hard decisions before pressure. Walk out willingly, not dragged out mercifully. For leaders, choose clarity over applause. It's always things about being clear, simple. Speak truth even when costly. That is one of the hardest things to do in life. And I'm not going to sit here and say it can easily be done, because it can't. But it does. You have to be on a fine line of nowadays how to speak that truth. Because truth is really heartbreaking sometimes, but it is open, and the person either is open about it or not. And it's whether or not their ears will allow for that to take place the proper way. Measure success by fruit, not following. So always give examples of things and why those things should be asked, rather than just implying it right onto somebody, in their walk and their faith. Sometimes, edging into it's a little easier in that standpoint, but you find out whether or not you're directing it indirectly is a little better, because, they can perceive it a little bit better than as if it's just directed straight at them. And those things sometimes are harder to deal with, but that's essentially what you have to do. And, whether it's, somebody that's fighting a challenge of relationships, and, building the proper relationships in the future time, and such as in this case like daughters, of incest, versus them going out and getting, a husband that, basically has a foundation, has a purpose. Because, essentially as a man, you don't want your daughters to, you want to look over them, because you're providing for them, you're giving them protection, and you want to provide, essentially the right things in place. But to do that, you have to give them that foundation. And so, and then that they would seek somebody like yourself. So if you're not showing that and presenting that, when they go out and look for a husband, um, you know, where can they find that proper person to give them that protection, to give them that unity of, of expression? So, I mean, a lot of times it looking at them as somebody that they can choose and be happy with, but at the same time that they can, give clarity, responsibility, and rightful, choices within their household, in their, home in general. So everybody, when they have kids, that they feel protected, that they have, the financial well-being to keep prospering. And so, leaders have to choose that clarity over applauses, speaking truth, even when it is costly, and then measure success by fruit. Good fruits that we give out, that's what's going to make a difference. Sometimes those fruits are not as easy to be seen. They're covered up by bad apples. Things is, whether or not somebody's wanting to pick out to find that good fruit. But that's the thing of it is, you can't give out these bad apples on that tree that we're trying to build up and have pretty fruit. You got to be able to let people find that nice pretty fruit, and that way you can get access to it, and people can see that good fruit and eat from it. And that's the hardest part, is getting them to eat from it, because whether or not it has a worm on it or anything like that, it could be somebody that just will turn away. And that's the hardest part about it. And you have to learn that people will just turn away and walk the other way. It's part of life. But you can't look at that as a downside. You have to look at that as a challenge to them and God, and that you have to just walk on and continue your daily living. As far as families go, you got to create those environments, not just rules. And so, who you bring into your house, who you let friends come in, who you want your daughters, your sons to be around. So they have a good willingness to grow and be successful. And choosing legacy over a lifestyle. Now, a lot of people love, this is probably one of the hardest things in this day and age, keeping up with the Joneses, having everything that in place, or having a really nice, place, and showing it off, and, keeping it, up, and, basically making it look better than what you can afford. And then you have other things like far as, the clothing you wear, the cars you drive, all those kind of things are depicted by your lifestyle. And sometimes they forget that legacy matters more. And so in this case, it's a hard choice in life, but that happens more and more. People are having issues with their economic prosperity because of that. And then on the other side of that is, people are living real well, but they don't have that curated home, and where they're, living at home as much. They're on the road working butts off, and they're not giving any real foundational ground. And they might provide the wealth and the well-being of that person, but they're not providing the mindset, the rules of engagement, and then also who they're engaging with, because that makes the bigger picture of whether or not that those family morals and traditions continue to grow on. The thing about traditions is it's a matter of, how close family is, how strong your family well-being is, and the choices that you make amongst your family. The end time choice in one sentence: Abraham left early, Lot left late. Lot's wife didn't leave at all. God is asking every man, leader, and family, which one will you be? Lot proves God rescues the righteous. And mercy is real, and judgment is coming. But Lot also proves delay shrinks destiny, compromise weakens authority. And family feels the cost first. If you want more info on this, I mean, we're going to go more in detail. We got another section here that we're talking about more about spiritual warfare, and that'll be our next segment, dealing with Lot and Abraham and how Abraham's life, verifies the righteous side of it versus how Lot's contentment and how it's kind of broken down that society feel. That'll be next time on our lesson.